Welcome to the Be Here Now Guest Podcast. This series features a collection of teachings and conversations centered around mindfulness, spiritual growth, and living a life in balance. Each week, our diverse network of guest teachers and hosts offer up wisdom and practices from a different spiritual path and perspective. If you would like to support this podcast, please visit BeHereNowNetwork.com/donate.
All right, so we are back for, I think, our fourth time of getting together in the Ram Dass Explorers Club. And it's this place where we come together in this profound intersection around psychedelics and spirituality and science, sort of in this realm of legacy of Ram Dass. If you haven't met me before, I'm Jackie Dobrinska. I'm trying to help support this community in coming together and diving into this exploration. And I'm really excited for this incredible conversation we're going to have tonight with our special guest, Dr. Sylvestre Quevedo. And he has this long journey where he's woven together this tapestry of threads from both Western medicine as well as Indigenous traditions and wisdom. And it started all the way back in his undergrad work, through his collaboration with Indigenous healers, to his research with MDMA-assisted therapy. So just to dive in a little more, in the 1960s, Sylvestre was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley when he learned about the similarities between serotonin neurotransmitters and tryptamines. And the quote that I read was, he wondered, why are people not studying this? So he went on to medical school at Harvard, where he worked with researchers studying MDA, which is an analog to MDMA, which was legal at the time, and to looking at enhancing therapy sessions. And then he went on to study law and public policy at Stanford Law School. He did internal medicine at Stanford and a fellowship in nephrology and medicine at Stanford University Medical Center, where he was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation clinical scholar. So I'm a little vague on the timeline, but at some point he was doing many, many years of family medicine across the Southwest of the US. And then he was also working alongside ayahuasca shamans in the Amazon and medicine healers in China and Indigenous healers in Kenya. So maybe you'll clarify that for us. And then in 2015, all of this started to blend together. His son had been in the Navy and came home with some trauma, and he started asking colleagues about PTSD, sort of looking for a way to help. And he learned that MAPS was looking for researchers for the phase 3 clinical trials, looking at MDMA-assisted therapy to treat PTSD. And so he became the co-lead for the San Francisco arm of the study. Do I have that pretty much right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And so you bring this incredible understanding about psychedelics and spirituality, and you've been connected to Ram Dass in a broad way for many, many years, and connected to these texts like the Bhagavad Gita and the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which were books that Ram Dass also used to help understand his psychedelic experience. Yeah. So it just feels great to bring all of this together. So I'm just going to invite our satsang to welcome you with the sign language applause. This is how we applaud. So glad you're here. And then I just want to talk to the satsang for a second and just tell you how tonight is going to work. And so in case you haven't been here before, so we're going to start with 2 short clips by Ram Dass. One where he's talking about psychedelics and these texts, and the other is from when he did these lectures at Naropa in the late 70s around the Bhagavad Gita, which then led to this book that became Paths to God. And then we'll turn it over to you, Sylvestre, to sort of lead us on a journey. You and I will chat, and then we'll open it to live audience Q&A. So if you're in the audience, you can raise your virtual hand and I'll call on you, or you can type your questions in the chat. And that whole part will last anywhere from 60 to 75 minutes, depending on how it rolls. And then we want to make sure you all have a chance to connect as a community and learn from each other. And so from there, then we'll go into breakout rooms where we'll have a question prompt for you where you can learn from each other and talk about your own experiences. And then we'll end the evening. So how does that sound, everybody? We're in for a journey tonight. Great. All right. So let's start with these clips, if that sounds all right. Let's see. We'll start with this one. I might have to Okay, let's go ahead and share this.
I look back, when I look back 12 years ago, it seems terribly unlikely that I would find myself studying in Hindu temples or teaching at Buddhist universities. I mean, my whole value system didn't include that at all as a Western intellectual liberal. So whatever happened in those years, and for me, the major impact was my experiences with psychedelics, because after having had these experiences, when I looked around for systems to explain what was happening to me, or for a system to be able to stabilize or to deepen or to proceed with this process that was going on in me, I found a paucity of possibilities in the West, and kept finding these books from the East, which were describing exact experiences that I was having. And so it was apparent to me that somebody knew what we were doing, even though we didn't.
So that's the first one. And then I'll share again.
Because that is the spirit of the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is concerned with service and with wisdom, the higher wisdom. But it is all ultimately in the Gita in a context of devotion. And chapter 12 is in a way the love focus of that particular bhakti quality of the Gita. But if you reflect on the way Arjuna is taken through the sequence by Krishna, you realize that at some point Krishna says to Arjuna, "It is because of your love that I'm allowing you to hear all this and see all this." And the vision that is bestowed upon Arjuna, which is an incredible grace to have that vision, the vision of the cosmic forms, the vision to open the third eye to see without looking, and the awesome and in a way horrible or awful nature of the vision, that was only bestowed on Arjuna because of his love, really, and his devotion and the purity of his relationship to Krishna. Because love makes the thing happen so easily. That opening of the heart makes it happen so easily. In the Psalms, David says in the Old Testament, "Because my heart was enkindled, my reins also were changed." And in that horse image, that chariot image in the Gita, where the reins are the mind, and applying that, when my heart was opened, that made it easier for my mind to change. Because that is...
I picked that quote because you and I had this incredible conversation about how these substances open our hearts and what that can mean personally and collectively. And so I'd love for you to just take it away from where you feel like is a good place to start.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful quote. Well, let me just say thank you to everyone for being here with us. One of the beautiful qualities of the Ram Dass community is this tremendous understanding of the bhakti path, and the good feeling that always comes with our community, really from the heart, feelings of the heart. And so with that, I both welcome you and thank you. And just picking up from what Jackie was saying about Ram Dass's quote, it's fascinating to think that he said that then. It's cultivating the quality of love in your heart, of loving kindness, which allows you to change your mind. It's an interesting idea. So let's go kind of back around and kind of frame this a little bit. So as everyone, I'm sure, has been in the midst of, there is this sort of renewed activity, interest, some say renaissance, around psychedelics. in the last several years, and lots are happening to to say the least, with respect to this. And I've often found that Sasha Shulgin's way of separating the large classes of psychedelics into empathogens, and these are the phenethylamines. This is MDA, MDMA. These have a chemical structure similar to amphetamine, epinephrine. They're stimulants. And a lot of times people get sort of stuck on that MDMA is an amphetamine, et cetera, et cetera. In biology, small side chain alterations can have very huge, big biologic effects. So MDMA is not like methamphetamine, which is quite harmful. Anyway, it sometimes confuses people. Most recently, it confused the FDA in our recent reviews. Anyway, we'll come back to some of that. But the phenethylamines are empathogens somehow. And in the plant world, it's certainly peyote is the sort of cardinal substance in this category. Somehow they create an heart opening. They somehow promote pro-social behavior. We know that they're helpful in creating social bonding. Now we know, mediated through the actions of oxytocin, a hormone, et cetera, and we can talk more about the physiology. So this broad category of empathogens is one, and Sasha always pointed out that the other broad category, and those of you who know his work, Tikal and Pikal, phenethylenes I've known and loved, and tryptamines I've known and loved. It's a great title. Anyway, the other category, the tryptamines, often referred to as entheogens, and people get really involved with this and really worried about the notion of, sort of changing your belief systems and all of that stuff. But there is no question that the tryptamines are often associated with deep transcendent or mystical experiences. And there's a whole literature on this. It's been studied over and over again, and it seems like it's really there. And it's not that this is sort of fun and games or a panacea. Sometimes these are, as Ram Dass said, awful experiences, filled with awe, but can be quite terrifying, et cetera, et cetera. But they give people a sense of touching in to transcendent realms, to the divine, et cetera. So those two broad categories, entheogens and empathogens. And I've been thinking about this for 30 years or so. I think there's really something to it, and it's not a hard and fast distinction. There's overlap, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's a good way to think through this. So as we think of that as background, it leads us to a whole discussion about where these agents may fit, et cetera, et cetera. But again, if we come back to sort of the kind of the Ram Dass teaching and the lineage, in the early days, there was no question that Ram Dass and Leary were really facing some of these issues. And he even said this in the clip. He started looking to other traditions, Tibetan Book of the Dead, and Leary and Ram Dass wrote the psychedelic experience in the 60s based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Which, of course, has lots of discussions about transiting the state between living and dying, the so-called bardos, et cetera. So there was early on an awareness that these were deep, important, spiritual, and existential kinds of questions that somehow psychedelics were opening up for people. And to the extent that the interaction was what we'd call successful in a way, deepening their understanding. So just a couple of sort of background comments there. There's a lot. Maybe another comment on the first clip where Ram Dass said that it sort of changed his mind. One of the things that we're becoming more aware of, really, in the last 30 or 40 years, is that people come to an experience with a particular worldview. This is an orientation. It has a long history in philosophy, and that Nietzsche, for example, wrote a lot about it. But this idea that the way you experience things is colored by your prior experiences, your culture, your history, etc. And all of that gives rise to not only a theory of knowledge, a way that you understand epistemology or how you know things, but also a theory of reality, your metaphysics. And also in there is embedded notions of ontology, what your being state is. Now, all of this, the reason I say this is because the academics have spent the last more than 40 years, probably 100 years, really beating on each other to try to figure out what all this means. And I think the value of using the worldview notion is it combines them all into one composite and underscores the point that your worldview is important, and it leads to a perspective. And the reason this is important, I think, is because it allows us to understand other worldviews, not necessarily accept them, but understand them, and to move into a more comparative approach to epistemology, to understanding each other, etc. Anyway, so just to comment on that, he sort of alluded to that in the beginning, saying that he just wasn't prepared for what happened to him because he was sort of a Western intellectual and and found himself, in India and that sort of thing. And clearly with psychedelics, this is not unusual. People will have a big experience and be in a huge creative or exploratory phase right after. So I'm going to sort of stop with that. And just see if there are any sort of reflections, thoughts, Jackie. I don't know if anything, because there's a couple of other things I want to go on to, but I don't want to just ramble on.
Yeah. If people have questions, they can put them in the chat as well.
Okay. Good.
Yeah, but I appreciate just that sort of background and explanation of helping us understand these different ways that because we can often just clump all of them together, all of these different medicines, and to really understand how they're working.
Right.
Yeah.
And we can come back and talk about psychedelics more. There's an explosion of research. And lots of experience that's collected over the last, really 50, 60 years.
I so appreciate the going to the text, like that you and Leary and Ramdas and all these people going back to these spiritual texts, because they have a wisdom. I have worked with lots of people in integration where they've had the awful experience, and there's some quotes from the Gita that just like help them make sense. Like, oh, that's what I saw, but they didn't necessarily have the background of the framework before, and so going to these ancient wisdoms, I think, can really help make sense of it. And we're not necessarily grounded in it in our culture. And so it's an interesting piece as well.
Right. It's also interesting that he sort of quoted the Old Testament, the Psalms, the book of Psalms. So that's also interesting. So the whole sort of perennial philosophy notion that Huxley has written about. There are certain gems that you find in all the traditions that sort of point in the same direction. So this is fascinating. But there's a lot more, but I want to come back to the Gita, but let me introduce this in a sort of a little bit different way. I'm going to tell you about an experience I had with an ayahuasca healer in Brazil. He was Peruvian, Pablo Amaringo. I worked with him for a few years in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and became quite close to him. Pablo has since died. He was a Peruvian ayahuasquero for many years, and then really a ceremonialist for after that, for pretty much his whole life. I once was with Pablo, and I said, you're drinking ayahuasca, Pablo, and what happens if you have a hard time with the medicine? What do you do? And he told me something I never forgot. He turned to me and he said, remember, you're in the presence of the divine. So when you have a hard time, practice reverence and humility. He said, and then he said, the divine really likes those two things, and you'll be okay. The medicine will take care of you. I said, whoa, that's kind of like wise, reverence and humility. I've thought about that again for years. And there is something about that sort of reverent in the sort of face of this sort of cosmic mysteries that we encounter every day. But also this notion of humility. And a lot of times people mistake humility for sort of submission or obsequiousness. It's not at all that. It really is an awareness that you're participating in a much larger process where you're really not the center of it and probably even not that important. So there is kind of humility in the face of God, this sort of idea. So anyway, that as a background shows you essentially what Ram Dass was saying. From many different traditions, there is this sort of, hey, you're encountering something that has to do with, ultimate reality, unitive consciousness, the divine, God, all of those words, and there's something about psychedelics which brings you to that place, and so that's again another way of saying it's often that people will turn, as Leary and Alpert did in the early days, to the study of sacred texts as an effort to glean understanding, and we can go on. There's a new book called The Immortality Key, which is a lot about dying. So it's interesting. That's very much on the stage right now. It has a lot to do with psychedelics, and we can talk about it. But it's interesting because it's the same exact thing that happened when they were first doing the LSD work in the early 60s. Right away, there were issues of living and dying. And really, to their credit, Leary and Alpert both looked to the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So with that as background, one important spiritual text certainly is the Gita. And I have to do this disclaimer, that I'm certainly not an expert on the Gita, but that's okay. All of us can have sort of a beginner's mind and sort of in praise of amateurs, especially in our spiritual work. So I turned to the Gita many times over the last really 30 years or so, trying to understand not so much about psychedelics. I came to it because I was working as a physician and often would feel really sort of worn out, depleted, like I can't do this anymore. And I would ask myself sort of the same question we're talking about psychedelics, of sort of what am I doing and why am I doing it? And one of the things that I realized is that I was really working hard to create meaning in my life, and also to experience something beyond the ordinary, transcendence in a way. And when I realized that the Gita was about the three paths to God, which in the Gita are Jnana Yoga, the path of study or knowledge, Bhakti Yoga, which is the path of devotion, or Karma Yoga, which is the path of service. And, a lot of people say, well, really, we really want to do a little of each of those, sort of the royal way, Raja Yoga. When I realized that, this was an ancient text that sort of figured out that the path to meaning and transcendence was through study, through, devotion and love, and through service, I thought, wow, that's pretty big. So I sort of kept coming back to it over the years, and every time I've done it, it's kind of like it offers solace, in the midst of woe. Something about it, that brings a smile to your face, and that's one of the beautiful things. And of those traditions of Jnana Yoga, of Karma Yoga, which all are important, my particular, and the reason that I'm so connected with the Ram Dass world, my particular affinity has been through the Bhakti path. And the Bhakti path is, as you know, really is about, well, I like to say, it's sort of, we learn this from Hanuman, joyful servant of Ram. Nothing makes you happier to be in the service of God, this kind of thing. Boundless energy. There's something about feeling that Bhakti love, as you would say in Kirtan or something like that revitalizes, that gives you a vitality and supports you in going through. And I think it is because love has this reciprocality to it. You give love and you get love, and that sort of thing. Ram Dass actually used to say stuff like that. But anyway, so and the reason I mention that is because there were a lot of parts of my life where I felt really, oh, this is all nice talk, but really it's Karma Yoga that's important. You got to be doing the work. You got to be making things happen in the world service, and that's certainly certainly right. But you can certainly wear yourself out doing that without the other pieces. So all, I think, are important. And as I think about those three categories of framing this whole thing, I've just found that it's been revitalizing every time I've come back to it. And it's been fun for me with talking with Jackie in the last several months to kind of revisit Paths to God, the series of talks that Ram Dass gave in the early 70s, I think it was, at Naropa.
Yeah.
And and very interesting disclaimers in that book. It's this book, those of you. But again, his brilliance, and not like Radhakrishnan or the other commentaries on the Gita, which are very academic and sophisticated in terms of the words and all the different sort of Hindi words and all that stuff. Ram Dass is so down to earth, sort of like, hey, this is real life. Let's make this work in real life, which I so respect, and it's not without its ups and downs, certainly. But anyway, that's my sort of kind of quick statement about sort of where I came to the Gita and how it's helped me over the years. So again, I'll sort of take a pause there, and there are a lot of different aspects we can come to, but I'm just would love to see what reactions and questions might come up for you.
Yeah. So feel free to raise your virtual hand, or write anything in the chat. But one of the things that I really appreciate about this conversation and bringing in the Gita and these three paths, especially around the conversation with psychedelics, is how often people are in the conversation around psychedelics, around healing, which is a big, and trauma, and that's a big piece of it. And yet, like, the integration piece of like, and then what? And it's like, what do you cultivate in your normal day-to-day life? And these paths coming back around of like, oh yeah, I cultivate bhakti, I cultivate wisdom, I cultivate service to help me really land maybe some of the insights I got through my psychedelic experiences. To me, that feels like the bigger piece that is important to make sure that we continue to bring into this conversation. I don't know what others might have to say around that. Have anything to say around that?
Absolutely right, and really sort of second that. Ram Dass used to say, sort of getting high is great, but then what happens when you getting high as you come down, right? So then, and one time he said, when you have a peak experience, and then you sort of, it's over, and then you kind of live the next few weeks, and you're living in the past. You want to do that peak experience again because it happened. You want to see if it's still there. So you want to, but why not make it part of your everyday? Why not bring some of that, here and now kind of thing? And I thought, so it's again, but how do you do that? And that's where what you just said, Jackie, where the Gita can help. Seeing those moments of loving kindness in your everyday life that are there. Seeing those opportunities to help others, to give, and in service, but also to be grateful when someone does that for you.
I think one of the key things that happens specifically, I don't know if it's both the different categories you talked about, but feels to me we get these glimpses of like, oh, wait, I really feel the interconnectedness. Like I know it. I don't just conceptualize it. Like I know this web I'm now a part of that's bigger than my own ego self. That I get a sense of my, like, the rightness, even though things are challenging. Like we get glimpses of that. And then we come back and it's like, oh, look at these texts have been saying that forever. Now I know it beyond my intellectual mind. I know it in my experience. And so like, let's live into it. Let's keep living into it. And I think that's what Ram Dass did for the last 40 years of his life.
Exactly. Yeah. And if you think about some of his teachings along that line, love, serve, and remember is kind of if you think about that, there's a prayer in the Native American church that in the Teepee Church, Peyote Church, which goes, it starts out by saying, infinite gratitude to all those who have gone before us, infinite love to all those who walk beside us, and infinite service to the 7 generations that follow us. And if you think about that, it's love, serve, and remember. The gratitude is remembering all those before. And love is relational, is the people next to you. And service in the Native American, in the Indigenous worldview, the 7 generations teaching is that the value of your life is measured by the 7th generation after you leave the world in a better place. Or sometimes Indigenous people will say, it's time for you to start thinking, what kind of a relative, what kind of an ancestor are you going to be? So how you live your life matters, and in a sort of longer view. But that whole notion really is encapsulated in the notion of love, serve, and remember, which Neem Karoli Baba and others, Maharaji always sort of embodied in many ways,
Yeah.
And there's so much more there. Wow.
Yeah, I know. So what, don't know if you want to jump into, we talked a little bit about the pathogens. We also talked a little bit about the community piece. Maybe, I don't know if there's any of those things. If you had something next you wanted to talk about, or wanted to bring some of that in.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, so MDMA is a breakthrough therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which, by the way, PTSD is much worse than people realize. I mean, there's tremendous suffering involved. It's a much bigger problem than people realize. Trauma is probably much more than is reported. And often, outwardly, people don't look that impaired or like they're suffering or injured, but inwardly they're tremendously injured. And so I have really learned how these mental health conditions can be much more serious, much more debilitating than is sort of apparent in many ways. So PTSD is important. It's very prevalent. And conventional therapies are not that good. 30% response rates with SSRIs and cognitive behavioral therapy, and lots of dropout, and the responses are not very durable. They tend to fade after 6 months. MDMA, the preliminary data is much more effective. So there's a role for these medicines in many of these situations, and there's lots of debate about that. But that's just one category. Quick comment on this: it's just the beginning. MDA and MDMA are related, as you know, but there are other compounds in this category. Sasha actually was quite fond of 2CB and 2CI and others that are comparable to MDMA, but maybe better. And there are people doing research on MDMA analogs, which may be even better than the clinical trials have shown. So that's happening in a big way. So that's sort of one piece. I mean, we can go into the research on the tryptamines. I mean, just a couple of quick things. There are very good data to show that psilocybin is not only safe, but really does reduce depression, is an effective treatment for depression. There's good data to show that microdosing psilocybin has profound effects on cluster headache and vascular headaches. That's another thing that's out there. There's much more, and we can go into it, but and there's an explosion, I think, of people jumping into psychedelic research, and there's a lot of controversy about this. I mean, there are some indigenous groups, for example, that do not want to see this entirely medicalized. I mean, they think that it should be more of a spiritual practice, and that people that don't have medical diagnoses should be able to use psychedelics as they do in traditional communities, certainly in the Amazon with ayahuasca for thousands of years, and for example in the Native American church with peyote. I don't want to romanticize all. I mean, there's definitely ups and downs and issues that have to do ayahuasca tourism and all that. On the other hand, there is definitely a lot of wisdom and skill and expertise among indigenous knowledge holders and wisdom keepers for many of these agents, as they have had as they've had a long relationship with these medicines. And the sort of centerpiece of so-called ethnobotany is not the plants or the people; it's the relationship between the two, and that's what ethnobotany is. Schultes and others have always sort of said that. And by the way, this is gets to the worldview question. Indigenous perspectives are fundamentally or primarily relational, and so that your ontologic status is in relationship. You're not an atomistic soul actor in the world. You're really connected to things, whether you know it or like it. It's there, and it's important, I think, to understand that. And part of the reason I say that is that we've had a tendency in our sort of modern, sort of really, it's almost, call it late modernity, to think that we have dominion over nature, which probably is kind of a naive. And to the extent that we come to terms with our relationship with nature and the fact that we're part of nature, and that our extractivist approaches are probably not the best way, that there is a different way to relate to nature. I think that, and psychedelics often bring this. People have two things happen with the tryptamines. One of them is that people have big spiritual experiences, but they often come back with a renewed sensitivity, awareness, appreciation to nature. And I think that's really valuable. I think that's really important now. We're in a period where basically taking from nature, extractivism, has kind of been our mode, and it's coming back to haunt us. I think. I
feel like this is such a big part of the experience of like waking up, of remembering this interconnectedness, and this, like, we're not the center of the world. This anthropomorphic view of like only about what only matters to humans, and we have these experiences in these. Whether you get it through meditation or you get it through psychedelics, it's like interconnectedness and connection to nature and being able to like hear what the grasses are saying. But then we come back to this state. And that's why I think communities like this are so important. It's like, oh, if I just atrophy back into what my culture around me is doing, it's like, how do I keep that connection going? What do I do in my day-to-day to get out of the systems I'm entrenched in and remember that glimpse I got in the psychedelic or meditative, experience? I don't know if you have any answers for that.
Well, I mean, my quick answer really is, I mean, this is your song. This is the social construction of reality. This is the reification of the things that you've experienced and your social support. So it's important to have community. Absolutely. And one of the reasons that people say the psychedelic renaissance is happening is that it's no longer work, church, or school that's your community. People don't have community anymore. So it's really a phenomenon. The way that has exploded with psychedelics. And I think it's because people are yearning for being in community. And there are lots of issues with that, but it's...
Yeah, and in community, that where your heart is open, where you're able to move past the constructs and the othering and all the things, and this can often happen, where there's this deep sense of connection and communion and...
This is really interesting what you say, because I a lot of times there's a lot of anxiety right now about the psychedelic renaissance and sort of cult behavior and abuses and all that stuff, right? That's all out there. So you want to sort of wonder about community, getting community right, that sort of thing. And and one of the things I think that's amazing about the Gita and about the Bhakti path, for example, this was an exploration of the technology of being in relationship through the practice of loving kindness, and it's kirtan, it's devotional singing with your sangha, with your community, I think from the experience how powerful it can be. It's one thing to be chanting and doing your prayers individually, but doing it in kirtan is completely different. So these and community also is important because it represents support. This is a big deal in sociobiology. Human beings do not do well in isolation. They're social. We're wired for sociality, for being in connection, and it's not. I mean, it's biologic. It's stuff that you feel. And so, yeah, community is really important, and it's difficult because it can be not the right people. It can be a structure that's not well maintained, et cetera, et cetera. And that's sort of what you're getting. It's one of the reasons I think I'm doing kirtan with a group now that is old friends who've been through many iterations. But they open the kirtan by saying, okay, we're going to sing our prayers. That's all we're going to do. We're not going to preach. We don't follow any lineages. We have no doctrines. We're just going to sing and pray. So I think there's something beautiful in that, is that it just allows you to connect in a devotional way, to open your heart and to connect with each other and with the divine.
Yeah. Do you want to, I think you and I had talked a little bit about, this need for spiritual work. And then we had talked a little bit about community and this, we come back around to it again and again, this idea of set and setting. Mm-hmm. I didn't know if you wanted to bring anything up around that.
Well,
especially around like the practitioners, I think we dove into a little bit.
Well, there's really a lot in this. I mean, the first thing I'll say is that, whatever the ups and downs were in the early days in the 60s, one of the brilliant strokes, and it really was, I mean, they weren't the only ones, but they were the two that really brought it out. And it was Leary and Alpert. And Leary actually said, if you try to talk about LSD without talking about, the expectations or the mental set or the setting, it doesn't work, because it's the drug, the set, and the setting. And it's become sort of a truism in psychedelic therapies that it's medicine, set, and setting. Those are the three things that are the important ingredients. Some people include purity of the substance, but assuming that the medicine is pure, it's medicine, set, and setting, and it is an interaction. And we can discuss a lot of that, but that was one of their really the early insights. Really in '64, they were writing about it. So it's remarkable that's really lived on. And there are people that are trying to isolate out in a sort of reductionistic way, setting, and drug, and it hasn't really worked very well. So it's an interesting question, and we can talk about some of the research aspects, but definitely. So yeah, is the mental set or the expectation important? Absolutely, yes. Jackie and I were talking earlier, in the old days, in the 60s, during the LSD therapy period, a lot of people were asking, people like Leo Zeff and others, should I take psychedelics? And they would say, psychedelics is going to teach you about yourself. They're going to show you things about yourself. You're going to know yourself better. And some of it you may not want to know. So if you don't want to know about yourself, don't take psychedelics. And so that's a pretty interesting view, so yeah, I'm trying to think of what else was going with that. Yeah, I think it gets to this issue of set, which is, what are your expectations? And more fundamentally, why are you doing this? Why are you taking psychedelics? And and it's, I mean, people say, it's just recreational, this and that, and all that's fine. I'm sort of not judgmental about any of that stuff. But my sort of qualification is that psychedelics are so powerful and so valuable that they're almost too valuable or too important to be done casually. I mean, if you're going to do it, you really want to get the most out of it. So why you're doing it is important, and then who you're doing it with, the setting, and not just the people, but also the environment. And that's where you get into issues of nature and that sort of thing. And in certain traditions, in the ayahuasca world, for example, it's not like nature's a nice backdrop. I mean, you're communicating with the spirits. I mean, you're communicating with nature. You're communicating with the animals. There's a lot of stories in ayahuasca circles about, if the prayers are really good and it's a good circle, a jaguar will come up and sit in the circle with you. I mean, there's stories like that. So the idea that you're connecting with nature in a sort of neo-animistic way, I think is fascinating. And the anthropologists have, for many years, always said that animism was a primitive notion among pre-modern people, that spirits in nature, and Tom Berry and others in the really the late 1980s and on. A lot of the eco-psychologists and eco-spiritualists that were sort of writing at the time, but Tom Berry was a theologian and all that. But he said early, this idea that neo-animism or that animism was sort of primitive or pre-modern is silly. It's actually it's a more advanced notion because it shifts our relationship to nature from an I and it relationship to an I and thou relationship, if you use the words of Martin Buber. It changes the ontologic status that nature has to you, and that is that it's something sacred, special, and has a kind of sentience or intelligence or beingness that is, if not equivalent to yours, and probably smarter in ways. When in the ayahuasca world, in the time I was working with Pablo, people would say, "Oh, the plant is the teacher," and I would think to myself, man, if I had a teacher who was not a human, that would be a real improvement in my life, So
right.
Anyway, so I think it gets to that sort of setting question. Really, really important, and there's a lot that can be said on that.
One of the things that comes up as you're talking about this, and I think I learned about this through Martine Proctel, which was this idea in some Indigenous language, there's no to be, there's no I am, right? So that everything is actually relational. Like there's no I am this, it is what is my relation to this person or that right. object. And so that changes the way that we think. And I in this, like these non-ordinary states, when we start to really open to that understanding, getting out of our language, our constructs of our mind, and really opening to this way that we are all interrelated and interconnected, and just living from that. That feels like the setting. I remember at one point in our conversations, you were talking about the people, like how you carry the medicine is that's just as important. And as we are entering these conversations about what's moving forward in our world, like how does that piece get held? Like how is the medicine getting carried?
That's, I mean, there's a couple of big issues in what you just said. Maybe on carrying the medicine. So in many Indigenous traditions, the people that carry the medicine have a special status, like in the Peyote Church, for example, it's the roadman who brings the medicine around. And I once asked Pablo, I said, what makes a good medicine carrier, and how, what goes into that? And he said that the defining element, the defining characteristic of a medicine carrier is his or her personal relationship with the medicine. So there's a dialogue, there's a relational thing going on, and it's very much along the lines that we're talking about. That these are not just sort of chemicals or herbs. I mean, these are sentient beings that you're in communication with. And the Western neuroscientists, they have a lot of trouble with this. We're working with a lot of them now in psychedelic research, and it just seems it's hard for them to sort of figure that. But suffice it to say, this is a very robust dialogue in science, and there are many people in conventional science, particularly in botany and in ecology, who really do believe and that there's evidence for so-called intelligence in nature, that plants are communicating. In botany, it's called plant semiotics. And they're putting out pheromones and various chemicals, and they're very sophisticated in what they're doing and that sort of thing. And then everybody was saying, oh, it's like, oh, maybe a little this or that. But Suzanne Simard's work, the mycorrhizal network, it looks like these are organisms that are connected by millions of connections, and they're interspecies. I mean, you have different species that are actually communicating, trading not only signals, but also nutrients. I mean,
cooperatively,
it's like, absolutely, yeah. And the plant biologists right now say, that we're used to thinking of plants as sort of like the flower on top and then leaves and the roots you don't see. But really the roots with the mycorrhizal network, with fungi and others that are all intermixed, and many of the roots fuse between species, which is an incredible sort of thing in biology. That whole array, that network of connections under the earth has billions of nodes. So it's as complicated as the central nervous system, probably more. So this idea that, our sort of complexity, we're at the top of the scale as human beings, it doesn't really hold up. There's other ways of thinking about it. But I think, again, what's important is opening up to these kinds of perspectives. And I think, again, part of it is because our relationship to the earth is very much an issue now.
Yeah. Agreed. So I want to make sure we have time to open it up to the audience to ask questions. I've been chatting for a while, and so I want to make sure that they get to ask their questions. And David has one in the chat, so I'll start with that. And then if anyone else has a question, you can raise your virtual hand or you can type it in the chat so that you can be in the conversation as well. And so David starts with, what if the setting, the indigenous shamanic setting, is cross-cultural and therefore doesn't match up with a person's mindset, the Western scientific mindset? And I'm curious, have you run into this, and what are some things? How do we approach that?
Definitely. And so there are a lot of issues in this. A lot of people are drawn to indigenous circles because they want to do the medicines in the traditional way, and all that's fine. But there are certain people that are better at being sort of cultural translators, interpreters for that. And I think that matters. Because sometimes in the psychedelic experience, it can be hard to figure out what's going on. So absolutely. Because you need that. You need people that are sort of cultural ambassadors and cultural kind of translators to help you through that. I think that's, really important. And it's not unique to psychedelics. I mean, I worked in Kenya for several years, and we sort of I worked with people from very different backgrounds. I mean, Africans who were trilingual with their tribal language, Swahili and English, who had PhDs from Oxford, that sort of thing, and Maasai healers who were really not very literate in any language, but spoke Swahili and Maasai. And so very different kinds of people. And we came to the sort of conclusion that dialogue itself may be, if not the epistemology of our time, certainly a very important epistemology of our time. So you need translators. You need people that can help you move between these different kinds of things. And it's absolutely right. I know people who have gone to classical dietas in Peru and they just didn't do very well. I mean, they didn't know what was going on. They felt isolated, and that's not necessarily the right way to do that experience. It's not necessarily anybody's fault. It was the wrong mix. So I think it's important to investigate, understand, look at the people that you're doing this with. And this comes up a lot because there's a big concern about cultural appropriation, which I think is well-founded. A lot of indigenous communities around the world have been sort of victims of extraction of various kinds for generations, et cetera, et cetera. Nothing new there. So yeah, we don't want to repeat that. On the other hand, if it requires translation in that there is some, I think, something to be said for syncretic approaches. And people have trouble with this because they don't think it's authentic in that. But actually, I don't have a problem with that. I think syncretism happens, whether you sort of want it to or not. Jung famously said all religions are syncretic. because for to become meaningful, they have to pass through your own individual filter. So what do you mean by God? This kind of thing. So yeah, I think that's something. I think what's important about the cultural appropriation debate these days is it really is important to acknowledge lineages, to acknowledge, to be grateful for them, and to be, I think, circumspect about how to interact with them, to think deeply about your own sort of cultural assumptions. There's an old Native American joke, it's attributed to Vine Deloria Jr. He says some communities have earthquakes, some communities have, tornadoes or whatever. We have anthropologists. I don't know if you heard this. So Indians often say anthropology starts at home. And that means, what are your implicit assumptions? What are you bringing with you that you assume is true that may or may not be true? So I think that kind of reflection is important in a lot of these things. On the other hand, there is no question that there are traditional healers who can be abusive, not good people. That's out there. So I don't want to be naive about that. But there are also indigenous healers that have tremendous wisdom that it's sort of locked up because people don't speak the language or they can't communicate with them. And so both sides are there. I think what's important for you as a person doing this is to ask those questions and to find that way of creating communication that's effective in the sense of enhancing understanding. And with respect to choosing circles and that sort of thing, one of the things we learned from the PTSD research over and over again is that one of the most important features that you can create for someone in the psychedelic experience is the setting of safety and trust. When you're taking, especially tryptamines, if you're taking tryptamines, you want to feel you're in a place that's safe and that you can trust the people around you. And it happens a lot that's not the situation. That's not a good way to do the tryptamines, in my opinion. Anyway, I'll sort of stop there.
That was all more. Fabulous. There's so much more we can go into with that, but yeah, thank you. Amy, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, Mike, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Hi, thank you so much for this today. So the thing I wanted to just mention and then ask is that I feel like you're living in between two very different worlds, it seems like, with, what comes through for me so far on the medicine journeys I've done are just our systems, the oppression of our systems and how they're not real. But we're so incredibly just buried underneath them. I mean, that I feel like every journey recently is just, that's been kind of what's coming through. And so it's like you're doing this work to make these medicines, more accessible, kind of like more broadly to people that maybe aren't taking this more exploratory path like a lot of us are, right? But it's like, but in that then, how I feel is no one ever should own these medicines or get to decide who gets to do them and who doesn't get to do them. They are from the earth, right? And so just that alone, I just struggle with so much, like with government and with just all this work to try to, get this stuff through. And then we know what's going to happen because, I mean, the almighty dollar, right? It's like that is the god of our culture at the end of the day, of our systems, right? So I just struggle so much with all of this. And I struggle with, coming out of my journeys, just being like, how do I live in this world? It's like, do I just move to Costa Rica and live off the grid and like nobody knows where I am? It's like all of the layers, right? I think that the complexity, it's not supposed to be this way. I mean, this isn't this, right? I mean, that's what comes through for me in the journeys is it's like, I'm a part of that out there, right? I'm not a part of skyscrapers and all this other man-made stuff, right? So I would love as a person that's walking in multiple worlds, I would love to hear just any kind of wisdom you have around navigating. And also with these medicines, it's like, the ownership, it's like they're going to end up belonging to somebody and who gets to decide who gets them and who doesn't and all that stuff, and I'm really struggling with that. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, you're so right. I mean, it's hard, and you're right. I mean, it is my life. Sort of walking between worlds. I mean, my sort of life is like being in a liminal state, which is, I mean, there's a good part to that. It's sort of creative, and all of that stuff. But there's a bad part in that you have to reify it in order to do things, right? So I have to be a clinical doctor at UCSF and all that stuff. And yeah, it's bad. And if you talk about drug development, you're right. This country is on this very sort of crazed sort of neoliberal path that everything can be monetized, and that the path to development is creating monetary models that can be, quote, scaled. I mean, it's kind of So yeah, drug development and big pharma. I was in the Sierra Mazateca. I was in Oaxaca, in the mountains, in the Mazatec region, and we were meeting with some traditional healers that were mushroom healers and that sort of thing. And one guy was a Mazatec guy who had gone to university and was an anthropologist, and he quit his teaching position because he just thought that anthropology at the big university in Mexico City was basically another sort of colonialist endeavor. So he quit and he went back to the Sierra Mazateca to work with the community, sort of community anthropology. Let's kind of develop our community and use anthropologic and ethnographic approaches. So he's a very interesting character, and he spoke Spanish pretty well, but also Mazatec and all that. And so I asked him this question. I said, what do you think about all this? Sort of mushrooms are really a big deal now all over the world. And he said, oh yeah, big pharma is here in the Sierra Mazateca. They're here. They're prospecting for new kinds of psilocybin mushrooms and this and that. I said, so big pharma, like Novartis and the big companies. He says, oh yeah, they have people out there. He said they call it benefit sharing. So you have these NGOs that are putting together, quote, benefit sharing things. So basically, they're prospecting for new drugs. And you're right; it's an international, global thing. That's what big pharma is. And this is the story. Those of you who know the story of MAPS, MAPS spent $300 million and 25 years trying to bring MDMA forward, and now his Lycos is now basically they couldn't compete with Compass and Atai and the other for-profit psychedelic development companies. Compass raised like $1 billion in the time that it took. MAPS raised, I think, 100 million. Compass raised $1 billion. I mean, that's the difference. So if you're a nonprofit or a benefit corporation, the U.S. They don't look favorably. If you're out to make a lot of money, they love that. I don't know if you, and we can go on and on about this. I think it's a problem. Obviously, neoliberalism is a problem in its own right. It worships markets. There's lots of evidence for market failure. It's nothing new, et cetera. It's just another new religion, and it's going to lead to lots of problems. It already has. I mean, all of the externalities in economic development related to this are obvious. And psychedelics are right there. It's a target, and a lot of people are sort of looking at that. But you should know, for example, that there was someone in about 2000 and I think it was like 2008 or something who tried to patent ayahuasca as an antidepressant, and the Indigenous communities group at the United Nations. They called a meeting, and all these guys came from all over the place with all their feathers on, and they said, "No way, this is not going to. Nobody's going to own these medicines." And they canceled the patent. So there is certainly that perspective and that viewpoint that no one should own these medicines, et cetera. And on the other hand, it's going to happen. I mean, I know, for example, that there are people doing chemical mescaline because they want to bring mescaline forward because there's an over-harvesting problem at peyote, and that sort of thing. So there's lots of issues that come up. But I think you're fundamentally right, and I think at the core of it is this question of what is our relationship to nature? Is it extractive? Can we own it? And if you don't believe that, then yeah, you're not in the mainstream in the U.S. certainly, but you're not alone. That's why we're here right now.
And Do you mind if I jump in on something? I'm going to throw in some
yeah.
Because I don't, like this is something that I think many of us have this fear around and like a constriction around because of the fear. It's like, and this idea, I think you said, like, do I just drop out and go hang out in Costa Rica because I don't want to be a part of the systems? And when you said that, because I, like many of you, listen to Ram Dass all the time, a lot of his quotes just sort of pop into my head. And the one that popped into my head, take it or leave it, was this idea of there's a lecture where he's talking about he could, cities would bring him down. So he didn't want to go live in cities until he realized that his lows were as interesting as his highs. And so he would get to the point where he would tell people, cities bring you down, go hang out in a city. Like, see if you can find the openness there. And so when you were bringing up that piece of should I go live in Costa Rica, that's what popped in my head. It's like, cities bring you down, go live in a city. And so I feel like maybe that's some of our work here of, instead of running from the fear of what might happen, how do we show up here and now and bring our truth and bring our peace? Take it or leave it. But that's what came up for me when you said that. David, why don't you go ahead?
Hi, Silver.
Hey, David.
Hi. I had a question about using psychedelics for healing outside of the medical model and also outside of even indigenous traditions. Given that the experiments with MDMA were using a inner-directed model, or the idea of a self-healer inside of us, is it possible for most people to use psychedelics outside of a medical setting or outside of an indigenous setting, just on their own, and just allowing that inner healing intelligence to work inside them? How necessary is having a guide or a therapist in the healing process?
That's a really, really good question, and there are a lot of different aspects to it. First of all, certainly with the tryptamines, but probably also with the phenethylamines. Personally, I don't think it's good to do them alone. So being with other people, even if it's one or two other people, I think is a safety thing. You could debate that low dose people are experienced and all that, but in general, as a general rule, so that's one thing. Secondly, outside of the medical model, so I have to do some disclaimers. These drugs are not legal, so I have to say that we're doing research on them, but I'm not recommending them because they're not legal, etc. But also, and Jackie and I talked about this, I talk about harmful drugs like every day to patients, drugs that they should not be taking, and they are, because that's part of harm reduction. That's what physicians do, and I think it's a responsibility we have, and I think it's absolutely right. And personally, I think these discussions are absolutely important and vital, and it's better to have them than not have them. So that's what this is about. So yeah. So getting back to should there be other venues other than the medical model? Personally, absolutely yes. There are people that believe that psychedelics can and should be, for certain people, available for growth and personal development. That they should be used and be available for that. They've been used historically that way, et cetera, et cetera. And what's remarkable about both the tryptamines, I'm really not going to qualify this because I think it's true certainly for psilocybin, but also the other tryptamines as well, and the phenethylamines. These drugs are remarkably safe usually really powerful drugs have what we call in medicine a therapeutic window. So that's where the drug is effective. That's the serum level that the drug's effective. And then the window is when the top part is when the drug's toxic, right? So any biologically active medicine can also be a poison, right? So that's the therapeutic window. Psychedelics are incredible. As powerful as they are, they have actually very little physical downside. It's not that it doesn't exist. I mean, there are things that can happen, but generally speaking, they're relatively safe. So yeah, I think it's okay. Should it be for everybody? Absolutely not. And this is the question of, who's a good candidate to do psychedelics sort of on their own or with their community, and who should be in a medical model. Personally, I think there are some parameters on that, and it's being studied, and we can talk about it. But people that have had a prior episode of psychosis, and I think you have to think twice. And people that have been in that situation, they say, I hate it when people say that, because that was it's putting a label on and all that stuff. I think it's important just to be aware that can be a risk factor for problems, not necessarily, but it's just something to be aware of. Secondly, the tryptamine certainly, and the phenethylamines increase cardiac, the demand on the heart, increase cardiac output by about 30%. So if a person has cardiac disease or neurovascular disease, if they have had strokes, and these are situations where you definitely would think twice. And in those people where there may be some benefit, but there are also some downside risks, those are people I think that are appropriate for the medical model. Like we had some patients in the MDMA trial that had some cardiac stuff, and we weren't it was early in the study, and so we weren't sure how high the blood pressure would go up, whether we would see arrhythmias and that sort of thing. So we would send the patient, for example, a couple of patients, to get on the treadmill and have an echocardiogram beforehand in order to really characterize their cardiovascular risk, but also monitor them during the session. And, frankly, they all did very well. It's just sort of testimony to the fact that these drugs are relatively safe. But I think you have to be aware of that. So it's a question of the risk profile of the patient, what could go wrong, what kind of person it is, versus the other issues, which are the quality and purity of the medicine, and then the setting. So yeah, I know Indigenous communities, for example, that would just be absolutely opposed to the notion of medicalizing this. I mean, it just seemed all wrong. Not least of which is that it becomes another sort of economic thing. People are doing it for money, that kind of thing. It's kind of considered sacrilegious in some circles, And it's not that people don't support themselves. You just don't exploit the medicine for personal gain. I mean, that's kind of so. Anyway, so that's just a perspective. I don't know, really, David, if that answers your question. I don't think it's an easy one, but and this is being debated in a big way in Colorado and in Oregon, which are creating avenues for non-medical use. And Ohio probably will follow. Massachusetts considering a bill. And this is a big issue in drug policy. And suffice it to say that the DEA and the FDA are freaking out right now. I mean, they don't know what's up or down. And I don't think they're going to be part of the solution. I think we have to help them. We have to educate them. But yeah, all of these issues are coming up. And why is it particularly an issue with psychedelics? Well, twofold. One is that there are uses beyond the medical, as we've said. But the other thing is that in our modern society, American society, the whole thing about anything called a drug has to be a prescription and controlled by doctors and all of that stuff. It's just a whole way of relating to these agents, and it has a lot of downside. For example, the FDA is saying, they don't want to. The advisory committee did not want to approve MDMA. It's coming back August 11th, and a lot of people are going to the mat on this. And there's still the expectation that it will be approved. But the FDA is already saying it's going to be single-use packaging with a single dose. It's going to have a REMS, which is a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, which will require it to be given in a doctor's office. So I thought when we finished the trial, we were going to be able to write a script for MDMA. I thought this is going to be great for therapy. It's not going to be that way. The FDA is going to make you prescribe one pill. It's going to cost anywhere between $700 and $2,000 for one MDMA dose. It's going to be in one package, and it's going to have to be given in a psychiatrist's office or something like that. So that's the debate that we're facing. And for those of you who've been around this, you can see there's a lot of insanity in the whole thing. But that's just a commentary on drug policy in the U.S. It's there's lots of that. Cannabis has been Schedule 1 for years. It's like, what? So anyway, I don't want to ramble on. There's a lot in that, but I think those questions are really important, and I don't think they're easy. The easy answers are in, but I think I just leave you with think a lot about the risk profile of the individual when it comes to whether that setting is important or not. And secondly, my opinion, my sense is that generally doing the tryptamines, or not so much MDMA, but especially the tryptamines alone, not necessarily a good idea. Have somebody around.
Okay, thank you. Amy, you had a follow-up question. Go ahead. And then we'll move on.
I did. Yeah. It actually is exactly what you were just talking about there, about doing them alone. I feel like I've been getting a lot of reactions around that. And my first 2 journeys, I had a guide. It's like $1,000 each journey. It's like so expensive, and I felt really safe. I did a heroic dose the second time, and I felt taken care of by the medicine. Like I just surrendered to it completely. And I felt like I was in the hands of source, And so in both of those journeys, I felt really clear on like, I want to journey alone. Like, I don't want this person here. And I don't feel like I should have to save up another $1,000 or sell something else to be able to do this. And so, I have my friends here that I have on an altar, and I'm very respectful, and I do everything that we did together. And I've journeyed twice alone, and I did like the heroic doses, and I did the lemon tech. So, it was more abbreviated, and they were amazing. I mean, they were, I just blindfold music, like the whole thing. But so when I hear people and like experts saying like, oh, you shouldn't do this alone, it's like starting to create fear in me. But it's like, I don't feel afraid. Like I trust the medicine. So yeah.
I'm so glad you brought that up. Really. I mean, because this is so yeah, let's talk about that. Metzner, Ralph Metzner he always used to say, be careful about, doing psychedelics in ceremony, because you pick up stuff from other people that's not your own. and if you have a guide that's got his own stuff and might be great for certain things, but not 100%. I mean, yeah, you don't want any of that stuff. So I totally understand that. Plus, I also understand how being in deep relationship with the medicine and cultivating that feeling of safety and trust and knowing your medicine, et cetera, can lead to very profound experiences, or it's just you with the medicine. And I absolutely understand that. So I'm not opposed to that at all. What I mean is that just somebody in the vicinity who might check on you, and you may or may not need that depending on the dose and all that stuff. But I would come to that after rather than before. So if you're not experienced, I don't necessarily, and you may not need to call on the person for a while. During COVID, there was a lot of people doing ketamine at home, and I mean, it's okay, but occasionally things happen, and it's really a disaster when you're not that well put together and something happens like that. So I think it's just important to be judicious, and it sounds like you've done that absolutely. But when I mean not alone, I mean somebody that kind of knows where you're, not necessarily in the same room. If you don't want them there, that's fine. But as long as they know you're there, and if you needed something or if something happened, they would know. So that's what I mean. The flip side is also true. Done in community, as with kirtan, with the right people, it has to be the right people. It can be much, very profound. So I'll just leave it at that. But listen, go ahead. Yeah. I don't want to ramble on because I know we're getting short on time. I want to make sure other people have a chance to talk.
Yeah, I just actually wanted to begin to move into our breakout session so people could chat with each other. But I wanted to see if there was any last thing you wanted to leave us with. I really appreciated that we got into what's going on today with legalization and the MDMA trials. And I don't know if there's anything we can do as individuals to help with that, or if it's just sort of on its own course right now, or if there's anything you want to sort of bring back around the Bhakti path, just to wrap up before we move.
Well, I'll just leave you with this, and this is a conversation that we've had. I was sort of thinking that, we're really interested in the biology of prosocial behavior. It's come up with MDMA a lot, because there's an oxytocin spike, and there's all this stuff about sort of how do we cultivate prosocial behavior. The work of Garcia Narvaez, this notion of the evolved nest, that we all need to have experiences of being nurtured and held lovingly in our lives, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of interest in that whole world of that whole area of prosocial behavior. And I think that Bhakti Yoga was a pre-modern technology for cultivating prosocial behavior. And there's something in that that I'm still sort of putting together in my mind, but something about being in devotion with others where you can feel that uplifting quality and that connection. It's just beautiful. And I think that's sort of what we're learning about, put it that way. And I'll leave you with that.
I love that. It reminds me, I think it's a Meher Baba quote about love, that you catch it from one, like love is right. That you can catch it from one another. And when you were talking about that, I feel like, in those situations, I feel like we can catch it from one another, and then pass it along to others. So you just have so much wisdom. We could talk for hours. I hope we get another chance to dive deeper. And again, I love this conversation of the sacred texts and the wisdoms they bring, along with the science of the medicine and what's happening in legislation, to just our personal experience. It really is so rich. And it's so grateful that you're here to share. So big thank you to you from all of us. And then definitely want to make sure people have a chance to chat with each other. So we're going to go into our breakout rooms. We'll have about 4 to 5 people in a room. We'll be there for about 20 minutes. Is there a question or a question prompt that you think would be great for the conversation we've had tonight?
We were talking earlier, the question that has been on my mind is, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this psychedelic renaissance? Why? And I think it gets to this question of, why are you doing it? I think that's an important question to sort of dig deep into.